We're introducing a nice feature of rich.traceback that when we get traceback errors, they'll be nicely formatted. We're connecting to this API, which I put in as a user dictionary, which is something that we'll get if we use the request library with .json as its function. We're going to get the first name, last name, age, and email. So when we come down to our class, we're going to have our user ID, which can be an integer or a string or a UUID field. And notice here, when we up top here using our alias generated to camel, this means that we're looking for camelCase only. So we'll need, for example, camelCase, not Pythonic case. But when we also want to be able to use our Pythonic names. So if we add populate by name, we can have both camel casing and our Pythonic casing that we have down here. And I'm overriding the user ID field because while all the rest map very nicely first name to first uppercase name and last name, age, and email, we're using something that this is not camelCase to the ID. So I'm overriding the field to say that we are using the ID when we get it up top. That's the alias we're using, but it maps to, in this particular case here, because a camelCase would be exactly the same, it maps to user ID field. So we overwrite this particular field. All the rest, the camelCase versions of these will map to their Pythonic names. One other thing we have in here is we have obviously stripping white space. Pydantic doesn't validate defaults set in the model because it assumes developers will be putting in the right default, but we can actually turn that on through validate default. And also if we assign it, not just through the default, but we assign it in when we're ingesting it into our model. By default, it allows this, so we're setting it to true. And we're also setting extra equal to ignore. So when we're getting all these fields, it's okay to ignore all the rest. We could have it as allow or forbid. Allow would bring them in, forbid would raise an error. We're also setting strict equals true for lax or strict coercion. And I put that in just so we can see a few examples later on. As you can imagine, we're going to get a lot of different complex ways of doing things. But in this very first case, we're getting a large API set of fields, and we're filtering it down to just the ones we want, setting the classes. And one thing to remember actually is that when, let's take this out here, if you set str pipe none, that means it's nullable, meaning that none it's a type, it's a string or none. When you see sometimes you see the case of optional in the old forms being used, optional just means which of two types. So this is nullable and it's not required because we're setting a default. These are non-nullable and required. If we did this, for example, and put none, but not this, that means we could use string or the none type as an example of the last name, but it is required. So we'd either have to specify null or use a string. So with that done, let's just run it. O1 user. And we get our printout using our nice rich. When we just print out the Python object, this is what we would expect. When we dump the model, we get the Pythonic names. When we dump the form a serializer and dump the model with alias equals true, we get the camelCase names. But when we do a model dump, by definition, it'll just give us the Pydantic model names. This will give us the alias. We can see the same with the model dump.json. The difference being is when it's set to true, it's the camelCase. When it's set to false, it gives us the Pythonic names, and this is the default. So if we ever do a model dump.json, it takes the Pythonic names and exports them out as a serializer into JSON, but using the names in Pydantic. And going back to see why we use this validate default, validate assignment, if I come back up to age, and if I put a string of say 3, in strict coercion, this will be an error. So if we run it again, we see we get the nice output from Rich of our traceback, which is nice. But we can see we get one validation error. The input should be of type of a valid integer. 3 is not. However, if we go back and turn off strictness, down here, if we comment that out, it will coerce a string to an integer. So when we come back down here to age, if we run that like that, that'll be coerced to an integer, and everything runs fine. So as you can see, there are many different ways to do things. What we're going to do is let's just return that back to 3 and keep it simple. Keep that to 42. So we've got our response from our request, which gives us a user dictionary, which we've included here for ease. And we want to get first name, last name, age, and email. They're in camelCase. So the way we can set up our Pydantic model is use an alias generator to camel, so it's expecting camelCase. But we would also like at a lazy date to be able to populate by name, or if we reassign any fields, or if we sort of basically want to set up an instance of user and pass in Pythonic names, that works. We're stripping white space. We've got validating defaults. Normally we wouldn't need that, and validate assignment. We're setting them to true to apply for further Pydantic checks. We're ignoring all the extra fields. It could be forbid, which will be a validation error, or it could be ignore or allow, in which case it would put all of them into the model, but it would not be serialized out. And we see we get all these data here, and we printed it out. And in the next few, we're kind of just going to add what might be some of the more usual common ways of dealing with a REST API. And there's also a link, if you want to go into greater detail in a very good course, there is a link in the PyTest Cookbook for a very good detailed course on that.